Welcome to another episode of Erik Whiskey Studies, and in this video, I'm going to talk about Scotch Whisky production byproducts and basically the principles of reduce, reuse, and recycling. Now, this is not a topic that gets talked a lot about by whiskey enthusiasts, because by the time we get to this topic, we're already past anything that had to do with the whiskey in and of itself. We're talking about the byproducts. However, if you want to understand the business of Scotch whiskey, if you want to know other things that have an impact on the cost of Scotch whiskey, if you want to have an understanding of even a little bit of politics that gets involved in Scotch whiskey, you need to have some understanding of the byproducts of Scotch whiskey and what Scotch whiskey distilleries are trying to do in order to deal with these byproducts. Speaking of which, one of the byproducts is packaging, including bottles, these tins and so forth, corks and other stuff. And I'm just finishing up a bottle of the Glenfiddich 15-year-old Solera. This is an older bottle. They have changed their packaging style. This happens every few years. A distillery wants to change their look. Customers perhaps get too accustomed to how something looks, and so they want to change things up, maybe look fresh, and then people will say, oh, that looks something new, and then they'll buy it, not realizing they're really just buying something that they bought before, just, with a different package on it. Also, there's always an issue of, having been exposed to air this much, has the whiskey gone off? People like to refer to it as being oxidized. That's not correct, but we'll go with it because that's what people know what the word is. So maybe finish up this bottle here or shortly thereafter, working on the heels. So Scotch whiskey production byproducts. We want to also look at reusing, reducing, and recycling. A seldom discussed but important topic is the waste byproducts of Scotch whiskey production. Just as the human body consumes food and discards waste, so too the malting, mashing, fermentation, distillation, and maturation of Scotch whiskey. In this lesson, we are going to learn about several Scotch whiskey production byproducts, including draft, pot ale, spent lees, carbon dioxide, and packaging materials. So some of these topics are typically talked about when we talk about mashing, when we talk about distillation, and so forth. I decided to discuss these topics all in one video rather than in the other videos so that we could see the number of different byproducts and consider them together and how these are all being reused. And be, more environmentally conscious in how we think about whiskey production. For every liter of whiskey, there is around 2.5 kilograms of solid byproducts known as draft, 8 liters of liquid known as pot ale, and 10 liters of spent lees, a watery residue. This amounts to 684,000 metric tons of draft and over 2.3 billion liters of pot ale every year, according to Zero Waste Scotland. Some of this waste goes to landfill or is dumped into rivers and oceans, but some is also put to better use. So far on the nose, it smells good, nice and fresh. Dried oranges, cinnamon, a little vanilla, a little caramel, very spicy on the nose, Christmas cake, dried black fruit notes, raisins, figs, really, really spicy. Draft is the spent grain residue left in the mash tun after the wort has been drawn off. It represents, as a rule, about 25% of the malt put into the mash tun. The spent grains left after the malting process are converted into pellets and sold cheaply to farmers as protein-rich cattle feed. Distilling whiskey is, in a way, based on the cradle-to-cradle principle. The draft returns to the food chain, serving as food for cows, and their manure enriches the soil where barley is grown. It can also be used to produce biofuel. Bioenergy production is principally achieved using anaerobic digestion. Martin Tangney, founder of Celtic Renewables, uses a fermentation process to transform whiskey byproducts into biochemicals that can replace some of the petrol and diesel used in cars and can be used to make other oil-based products as well. There are already whiskey-powered vehicles driving around Scotland. Glenfiddich Distillery, operated by William Grant & Sons, uses biogas made on site from the byproducts of its own whiskey to power some of its trucks, reducing the truck's carbon emissions by 90%. However, biofuels currently account for just 3% of the fuel used in global transport, so they have a long way to go before they can make a serious dent in carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. Bruichladdich had something similar to that, and they had a little electric blue vehicle they drove around on the island that they were fueling with biofuel made from their distillery. Whiskey waste can be used to create more than biofuels. The solvents from its fermentation can be used as an alternative to oil in plastics, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, clothing, and electronics. Celtic Renewables has raised more than 40 million pounds, that's $52 million, with backing from private investors, government grants, and crowdfunding, in addition to support from Napier University, which remains a shareholder. The company built Scotland's first biorefinery with the capacity to convert 50,000 metric tons of whiskey byproducts into biochemicals. So if a whiskey has had too much exposure to air, oxidization, it can become sort of like flat, stale, and doesn't have a nice fresh fruit character. This one just seems fine. However, having said that, it all depends on how often you're pulling the cork. If you're constantly pulling the cork and getting new air in there, that's when you're going to accelerate the deterioration of your whiskey. So at a whiskey bar, it'd be very different than a whiskey bottle on your own shelf. But this one tastes just fine. However, if you are a little concerned about that, you could always transfer a little bit of whiskey out of your bottle into a smaller bottle and preserve it that way. Pot ale. Pot ale is the residue left in the wash still after the first distillation in the pot still process. It is the residue of the wash after extraction by distillation of the low wines. It is rich in proteins and is commonly used as cattle feed, fertilizer, or turned into biofuel. Spent lees. Spent lees are the residue in the spirit still after the distillation of the foreshots, potable spirits, and faints. Spent lees is an oily, cloudy liquid with a slightly oily aroma. Water accounts for the majority of the liquid, together with some oily fats in liquid form, created during distillation, and the level of alcohol is around 0.1% alcohol by volume. It will be filtered in an effluent plant and discarded since it cannot be used any further. So if you're familiar with wine production, you don't want to confuse spent lees in wine production with spent lees in whiskey production. Spent lees in wine production is a byproduct of fermentation. So when you're fermenting grapes and you have leftover lees, that's dead yeast, that's a byproduct of fermentation. In wine, spent lees is the byproduct of the second distillation or spirit distillation in Scotch whisky production. However, even in wine production, spent lees is sometimes used in wine production. You could have a Chardonnay that is aged on the lees, on spent lees in a cask. This is called Sur Lees, or Sur Lee. And if they stir the lees during maturation, aging of the wine in the cask, this is called bâtonnage. And what it can do for a Chardonnay, it can give it sort of a biscuity character to the wine. But again, remember, don't confuse spent lees from wine production with spent whiskey production, which comes from the second distillation. Carbon dioxide, CO2. In a distillery, there are two main sources of carbon emissions: the combustion of fossil fuels to generate steam or heat, and the CO2 generated and released during the fermentation process. Technology and innovation is now beginning to provide opportunity to test the capture of this fermentation CO2 to use in different ways. So this is probably one of the hottest topics in talking about Scotch whisky byproducts because of environmental concerns. This is still a work in process as to how they're going to use this CO2. I've heard using and actually adding carbonization to soda pop and other sources. So you got to stay tuned on the development of the use of CO2. Post-production use of distillation byproducts. An innovative partnership between the Falkirk Distillery and a biotechnology company, BEVERAGE, aims to reduce the waste output, carbon emissions, and water footprint of the distillery by recycling whiskey co-products as feedstock to grow microalgae. Whiskey co-products like pot ale and spent lees are transported from the distillery to a commercial demonstrator site where they're used in myalgae process to create an omega-3 rich microalgae that can be then used as a nutritious pet food ingredient, reducing global reliance on wild-caught fish as a primary source of omega-3. There are plans for the co-location of distilleries and biotechnology facilities, which will create an on-site water recycling solution, further committing to the sector's goal of using water more efficiently. Biofuel. Scotch whisky distillers are creating their own biofuel as they burn their unwanted grain byproducts, wood chips, and other types of biomass for a source of energy in remote areas of the Highlands, where gas links are scarce and fuel oil is pricey. When I visited Ardnamurchan Distillery in April 2024, for example, they talked about using their own biomass as fuel for fueling the distillery. Most distilleries in Scotland have relied on heavy fuel oil to generate heat for distilling processes, but biomass such as wood, plant-based material, or organic waste is now increasingly attractive and reliable option. Diageo spent £17 million on a bioenergy plant with a capacity of 8 to 10 megawatts, or enough to power up 10,000 homes. The distillery gets over half of its energy from the biomass plant, which also saves around 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions a year. Tomatin Distillery, located 315 meters above sea level on the eastern edge of the Mondelez Mountains, produces 2.5 million liters of whiskey a year. Two-thirds of its over 40-strong workforce live in housing on its 140-acre estate. The plant is one of the oldest distilleries in Scotland, with whiskey thought to have been made at the site as early as the 16th century. But it has experienced troubled times, going into liquidation in the 1980s before being bought by Japanese sake maker Takara Shuzo Company. Tomatin has no gas links, had relied on fuel oil until last year when it installed a 4-megawatt biomass boiler that burns wood pellets. Biomass now has replaced 82% of the fuel oil that would have been used, and Tomatin has cut its annual fuel costs by a third. And a final topic is packaging. The packaging of whiskey, including bottles, labels, and boxes, represents another type of whiskey production byproduct. Distilleries need to ask, do we really need to put our bottles in a tube or box? Does it serve an actual purpose beyond the visual appeal on the shelf? Distilleries might be better to reduce production costs as well as production of byproducts if they reduce or eliminate much of the unnecessary packaging. One example is Brook Laddie Distillery, which redesigned their flagship classic Laddie bottle, taking a number of steps to reduce their impact and lower packaging emissions. The secondary tin was removed. The optimized bottle design means that it is 32% lighter than the previous version, while still keeping the iconic aqua color, now with an organic ink coating. The recycled glass content of the bottle has also risen to up to an average of 60%. This lighter bottle shipping means it is more efficient with more bottles on every pallet that enters or leaves the distillery, further cutting transport CO2 emissions when shipping on and off Bruichladdich home on Islay. By optimizing a number of design choices, the new bottle reduces packaging CO2 emissions by 65%, and the distillery will continue to review all elements of the production process to reduce its impact across the entire value chain from grain to glass. Really a delicious whiskey. If you haven't tried the Glenfiddich 15-year-old Solera, I highly recommend it. All right, I hope you found this video informative. This is our last in this series. We have focused mostly on Scotch malt whiskey production. I will in the future do a series on Scotch grain whiskey production and blended Scotches. All right, if you've not watched the rest of the series, I want to highly recommend it. And each video is a link to the next. All right, until next time, Slàinte. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.